Welcome to Point of View, CTV's new current affairs show. In this series, we've decided not to make another adversarial confrontational show. They don't work. Name-calling and shouting has seldom achieved anything. Instead, what we've decided to do is ask the questions of the newsmakers and listen to their point of view. Then, it's up to you, our viewers, to decide whether you accept or believe what you've heard. Now, no issue could be more important than earthquake recovery. So today, our guest is Earthquake Recovery Minister, the Honourable Gerry Brownlee. Minister, it's been 2.5 years since the SIR Act was passed and you became Earthquake Recovery Minister and SERA was set up. Does the time seem to you to have passed quickly or not fast enough?
Well, I think the time has passed very quickly, but it's like there hasn't been enough time for the amount of activity that SERA is required to do.
Now, in that immediate period after the earthquakes, at the time this SIR Act was passed, there was a tremendous sense of urgency, and I think there was even talk in those days that we'd get the city rebuilt in sort of 3 to 5 years. Now that we're 2.5 years on, did that seem like hopelessly almost optimistic kind of a timeline?
I think a lot of those statements made in early days were made by people who had to have something that they could cling to, and I've always avoided time frames and even putting in deadlines or having a point where you would reach a decision, because that I think becomes unfair as you find all the various aspects that you've got to consider before you make a decision. Sort of were materialising as we spoke. We were finding out more, for example, about land condition, more about the extent of damage on the physical infrastructure underneath the city, and more obviously about the extent of damage to buildings, and then of course all the differences that were being created by people's choices around the way in which they went about their daily lives. So timelines are not something that I've ever talked about much myself. I much prefer to get to a point where you can confidently make a decision that is going to give people a bit of a steer as to where we're going.
Well, we are 2.5 years into SERA's mandate. The Act set up the organisation for 5 years. Are they about halfway through their work, do you think, given what you've just been saying about obviously there have been a lot of complexities and issues that no one could have anticipated beforehand that have come bubbling up to the surface? So is that 5-year time frame still realistic for SERA, or might it have to be revisited?
Well, I think the point about the SERA Act is that it followed on from the Civil Defence Act. What we discovered is that, we're very good and well set up for responding to emergency circumstances, but that recovery phase is quite a different matter, and yet many of the aspects of recovery require just the same urgency as the immediate response does. So what the SERA Act effectively does is bridge that gap, to create that transition, and we would still want to be seeing that Act fall by the wayside within the 5-year period, because we should be able to transition a lot of the activity of SERA into either formal government departments or back to the Christchurch City Council. But there's no particular hurry for that beyond the expiry of the Act. So we would expect there to be some sort of government policy office operating in the city for quite some time to come.
Will that office include the Christchurch Central Development Unit? Because obviously they're quite involved with the anchor projects, and obviously those anchor projects are going to take some time to come to fruition.
Well, we're going to have a request for a proposal around the convention centre out before Christmas. We're likely to have the Metro Sports facility being in that sort of zone mid next year. Other facilities will be sort of developed along the way. The Avon River precinct is already underway, and ultimately a lot of that will be determined by discussions with private developers who are adjacent to it. So I think the early days of considering how you transition haven't yet been reached. A lot of people want us to signal that, but that's sort of part of the impatience of wanting to move on. I think we just need to see where particularly the next 12 months takes us and then work it out from there.
speaking about the anchor projects for a moment, the innovation precinct, what's happening with that? It's not one we've heard a lot about in relation to some of the other ones that you referred to. Obviously, the Avon River one is much more advanced, so that's probably why we've heard a bit about it. But I'm particularly thinking of some of the areas around High Street where there's still buildings that are quite damaged, fenced off, and there doesn't seem to have been much progress there. But what is happening with that?
No, it's dreadful, absolutely dreadful. And the Innovation Precinct is being led by the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, and they don't seem to be able to make much progress. Look, the background to this is that some of the property owners in there asked me to meet them on the site. I did. This is going back probably 2 years. They said, look, we can, if you give us time, don't put the demolition order on us now, give us time and we can sort this out. So I'm very disappointed that, having sort of backed off, with a lot of public furore over, taking the wrecking ball to all sorts of buildings that people thought were of great merit and could be restored, to see an area where there was strong representation from property owners to do exactly that, but now we're looking at absolutely no action whatsoever. So it is a huge disappointment.
Another issue which is of great importance to CTV staff, family and friends, of course, is the future for the CTV, or what was the CTV building site. Now that's within the eastern frame area, so have any final decisions been made about what might happen to that, whether it's kept as open space, memorial garden, or whatever might be the case?
No, not final decision. So at the moment the government has acquired that site, so it is in Crown ownership, and that gives you a huge amount of flexibility about what to do with it in the future. So we would expect that site will be more fully cleared, and that there would be some form of ground planting there in the very near future. But the long-term use of that site, far from determined just yet. A lot of that eastern frame will contain residential occupation, but that site is obviously particularly special and has its own sensitivities, and so no need to rush that. The sad events of that day will be with us for centuries to come, literally. So let's take a bit of time over deciding what's appropriate for the site. I always got on very well with Bob Parker. He didn't have a reliable council. That was a difficulty for him as the mayor. And also we've now got a different local body act which gives the mayors throughout New Zealand a different capacity to engage in the policy process.
I wonder if I can just talk for a moment with you about your relationship and the relationship of Sarah with the City Council, because it's, I suppose, sort of no secret that the previous Mayor and Council had a perhaps less than perfect or ideal relationship. Obviously, new Mayor's been elected, new Council, and I suppose we were all hoping that we could draw a line under what happened in the past. But in the last week you've had to give the council a bit of a hurry up or a wee reminder that they had responsibilities with regard to the land use recovery plan, and it would be good if they got on with it. Should we interpret that as a sign that things won't necessarily be better in terms of the relationship going forward, or is that hopefully just a blip?
Oh, look, I think there's a couple of things I'd say. Firstly, I always got on very well with Bob Parker. He didn't have a reliable council. That was a difficulty for him as the mayor. And also we've now got a different local body act which gives the mayors throughout New Zealand a different capacity to engage in the policy process, and that will be useful. I think the strength with Leanne being the mayor is that she will understand the processes that I have to follow very, very well, and is coming to understand the processes that local government works with. Look, last week wasn't really much at all, to be honest. I mean, it was one of those things where they clearly wanted more time to think about things. The reality is that I had a statutory responsibility to deliver that plan, and I had chosen to wait for the new council to see what they thought of it. That wasn't necessary, as it happens, but I thought it was the appropriate thing to do. And that engagement, I think, has been, to date, very, very good. There's some good thinkers on that council, and there's still 4 people who were there before, but they'll, I think, get the flavour of the new culture that's in the council, and it's all good.
Do you have any advice for the new councillors regarding the relationship between council and the government?
Well, I shudder for one politician to give advice to others, but the general message would be that we are here to help, and we're not going away. There was a lot of speculation prior to the 2011 election that post the election the government would pack up, leave town and leave it all to the City Council. That's not our intention. It's a terribly big problem. No other elected body or council has ever had to deal with something like this. And if you look at the relationship we've got with Selwyn and with Waimakariri, we will be on the same basis with Christchurch City Council for a long time to come. And I think once that's understood, that's a much better basis for moving forward. I've got to say, the proposals that they have added to the LURP, that's the Land Use Recovery Plan, and the willingness to deal with a lot of other land use issues, and particularly the rules around development, etc., is very, very encouraging. So we are putting together a process that will let them do that in a quicker timeline than the sort of 8 to 10 years that normally takes under RMA processes.
So in actual fact, there are encouraging signs in that case in terms of how the relationship might work going forward.
Well, I think so, yes. I was never as worried about it as some of the media people wish to portray, but that's. I guess we've shown this week that we can have a disagreement and we can reach a position that sees everybody happy.
Now, speaking of happiness, I wondered actually if I could just ask you a few questions about how you found the role of being Earthquake Recovery Minister. I mean, how, for example, did you actually become Earthquake Recovery Minister? Did the Prime Minister say, well, you're the Senior Cabinet Minister, here it is, you've got to make it work, or did you kind of put up your hands and say, well, it's my home, I want to do it?
A combination of the two, I think. So after September 4, I think there was an immediate assessment this was all very manageable. It was pretty disastrous, but we could get through it. But I had a view that actually was a little bigger than most were prepared to recognise. At that stage, there were 40,000 houses that were damaged. Probably most of those, about 30,000, 35,000, under the $100,000 cap. But the concern that I had was, if you looked at other cities where there'd been that level of damage, what did it do to real estate values? And people think that's an odd thing to think about, but what does happen if you toss a whole lot of people into negative equity because the value of your real estate is falling? And that sort of troubled me quite a bit. I thought it was preventable and avoidable. And so I think within a few days the Prime Minister said, okay, we'll create the portfolio earthquake recovery. You're it, and we'll work around that with the way in which you interact with other government departments. And remember that we had a recovery commission here for a while. It was the various local authorities. Frankly, it didn't work. It was a nice idea, but it was more about managing a smaller problem than materialised on the 22nd of February. So from that point, that was never going to work, and we needed to do something that was much more hands-on. If you look at other disasters around the world, and I did quite extensively between September and February, the one thing that stuck out to me was that indecision is the killer of progress. And even if it's decisions that people may not always agree with, at least it's there and it gives you somewhere to go. I have to say, I think the courts in recent times have lost sight of that and started to introduce indecision, which is a bit of a bother. But if you think of everything that was predicted, one is that our economy would collapse, two, that our population would depopulate, would be out of the place, and that we would have, as a consequence, very high unemployment and consequential social issues. And part of that also was the prediction that we would see our real estate base collapse with a whole lot of mortgagee sales and all the nasty stuff that goes with that. Well, we in Canterbury haven't experienced that. It's quite unique to any disaster of this size anywhere in the world. And people forget too, it's the fourth biggest insurance disaster in the world since 1972, so it's not small. And we're now seeing people worried about the rising price of real estate. We're seeing people telling us that there aren't enough workers available for the work that's available. So those two very important indicators going strongly in favour of Canterbury. And I think in part because of the structure that has been in place, but in no small part due to the fact that Cantabrians have just got stuck in and done things differently. And people do it every day, just the way they go to work, what they have to do at work, what they've had to put up with, etc. It's been quite amazing in my view. It really was, I would say, one of the finest hours for New Zealand Public Service, because they got together really quickly. Were able to propose an Act of Parliament that would let us do a lot of things, but also at Chief Executive level made the commitment that they would all be supportive of whatever arrangements that were put in place.
There's never been an earthquake recovery minister in New Zealand before. I mean, there've been health ministers, education and the like. So when someone is appointed, when an MP, a politician is appointed to that sort of a role, they've usually got a role model or at least some experience they can look at and say, okay, well, that's a good way to introduce policy, or that's a good way to run a ministry. For you, a new government agency, a department, SERA, so no back history there, and obviously a new role for you as well. So how did you actually approach that, or what did you look to in terms of getting a sense of what might be appropriate or what might be some good ways to actually manage the job?
Well, the first thing was to make sure that we had an Act of Parliament that enabled that to happen. And we've got very good people inside the government structures who serve any government of the day, who came together. It really was, I would say, one of the finest hours for New Zealand Public Service, because they got together really quickly. Were able to propose an Act of Parliament that would let us do a lot of things, but also at Chief Executive level made the commitment that they would all be supportive of whatever arrangements that were put in place. And so SERA as an organisation, as a Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, has sort of evolved over time, picked up the gaps between what other government departments could do and had capacity for, and where there was no capacity. So if you think about one of the big tasks they had initially was all the land assessments. Now it was EQC who was largely doing that, but someone had to bring that together as in a way that let a policy decision be made, for example, around red zones or other decisions around rock fall or cliff collapse or whatever it might be. And look, there's just a huge range of work that SERA has had to engage in. One of the interesting things has been some questioning of Roger Sutton, who was also on board fairly quickly. He was in the role by July of 2012. The question, 2011, sorry, losing a year, but it was, why do you have such a changing staff profile? And that's because people come into SERA, they do a job that is sort of completed, and they move on into other things. They're very highly sought after people. So we've been very lucky to have, I think, high quality staff working in SERA, and then you'd say some good results. It's easy to focus on the bad stuff, but there's so many things that have gone right for us. But we still have a long, long way to go to recover the city completely. You can do it with confidence if your economic base is strong, and we are more than strong. It's fantastic, and I say a tribute to the people of Canterbury, not to particularly do anything else. Although in the early days, I think the wage subsidy, probably, which is unique in the world, and a lot of other governments ask us about that, made a huge difference. It gave businesses the time to reassess how they were going to operate without the pressure of having to have cash flow, and that, I think, saved literally tens of thousands of jobs. But from a government perspective, it was a relatively cheap and good investment.
Now you mention overseas governments and agencies being interested in that. Is there a lot of interest from overseas in terms of what you're doing as Recovery Minister and also what Sarah is actually doing for the recovery and the rebuild?
Yes, there is. It's quite considerable. So we have obviously shared that legislation, but it's how you work with that that's important. So we keep in good contact with Japan, and they suffered their very bad earthquake soon after us, the tsunami, and we watch other disasters around the world. But I think what's really happened is that right across the world, where you had that one bad year, really 18 months, it started with the huge floods in Thailand, big floods in Australia, earthquakes in New Zealand, earthquake in Japan, earthquake in China, and probably from the size of the disaster in New Zealand, being the sort of country we are, it had a bit of a wake-up effect on many other countries. And so the west coast of the United States, for example, very, very focused in California, Seattle and Washington, and those seaboard states on the Pacific Rim, at looking at what we're doing here and wanting to collaborate with us and where we go from here. So the Ministry of Civil Defence, very much onto that. New Zealand, I think, has also got a heightened awareness of other hazards around the country. One of the geologists happily told us in the early days that, life's great here in New Zealand, but you live with your risk. He just happily went through volcanoes in Auckland and various earthquake possibilities throughout the rest of the country, tsunami risks in various places. So very happy sort of advice for us. But it does mean that we've got to sharpen up a lot on it, and you can't do it all overnight. But we have, for example, moved civil defence out of internal affairs and into the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, so it has a much more direct oversight from ministers and indeed the Prime Minister if he chooses.
Given the issues that weigh on your shoulders, you do seem remarkably bright and upbeat. Do you enjoy the challenges and the responsibilities of being the Earthquake Recovery Minister?
Well, I think it is a big responsibility. I certainly take that on. But I see an awful lot of the good stuff as well as the bad. So yeah, I know that people have got issues with EQC. I know that people have got issues with their insurers. But then I look at the big numbers for what are the settlements, what are the repairs that are being done, and you can see a big picture. I do get a lot of people just come up in the street and want to tell you about their good experiences because they're sick of hearing about all the bad stuff. And so my assessment is that while we've got a long way to go, the optimism about the future here in Canterbury is extremely high, and we have significant opportunities to brand this city as being a great place to live, as it always has been, and with a very, very strong future.
Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the point of view of Earthquake Recovery Minister, the Honourable Gerry Brownlee. Join us again next time for another point of view.